In a Marxian definition, your class position is determined by what you have to do to get what you earn. So here, the class concepts are not quantitative ones like lower, upper, and middle. The Marxian definitions are qualitative concepts like worker versus capitalist, petty bourgeois versus bourgeois. If unions don't start fighting back, they're at the very last gasps of their existence. And now I think a lot of unions find even that threat to be acceptable to them. Poor people constantly disappoint intellectuals, unfortunately, and hopefully the poor will rise to the level where intellectuals can see them as being worthy of their time at some point.
Okay. Hello, Vivek. Good evening. Thank you for joining me. So I would like to get right to it with discussions of capitalism and class, and I was thinking of moving on from there to class struggle and concepts such as populism and how can we overthrow capitalism today. So let's begin with the basics. How would you define class, and in what ways would your definition diverge from other mainstream or critical approaches to class?
Well, my definition of class is a fairly conventional Marxist definition, which is class is a kind of social structural relation which determines how you go about earning your income. Now, what that means is your class position determines what you have to do to earn your income. In mainstream definitions, your class position is determined by your level of the income. So in a mainstream definition, what you earn will settle which class you are assigned to. And the distinctions, the concepts that they use are indicative of this. So in mainstream definitions, what you have is lower class, middle class, upper class, as if they're rungs on a ladder. And each class level is defined by an arbitrarily set income level. So lower class can be people who fall below a certain income level, and you can set that level. It can be the official poverty level, or it can be a level above the poverty level. Then the wealthy and the rich can be defined as people who are in the top 1% or 10% or anything like that. What's key to this is that your class position is determined by what you earn. In a Marxian definition, your class position is determined by what you have to do to get what you earn. So here, the class concepts are not quantitative ones like lower, upper, and middle. The Marxian definitions are qualitative concepts like worker versus capitalist, petty bourgeois versus bourgeois. Income differences have a place in these distinctions, but they are not what determines the distinctions. So you could have people in two different classes who make the same income, but where the reason they're assigned to different classes is that they have to deploy different strategies to earn their income. So in my view, that's the essential difference between a Marxian and a non-Marxian conception of class. And I think that's fairly conventional.
Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like you would privilege an understanding of class as one of a relation, as in because you've described us as it's what you do rather than it's a status that would be considered.
Yeah, because in Marxism and for the entire Marxist tradition, there's two things that are central to class, which is whether or not you're exploited. And the second is what you have to do to achieve that exploitation or freedom from the exploitation. So you belong to either an exploiting class or an exploited class, or a group that's neither exploiter nor exploited. Those are the key things. And whether you're an exploiter or exploited, whichever of the two you are, your structural position determines how you relate to someone else. And that's why it's intrinsically relational. You cannot be an exploiter without being involved in a social relation with somebody else, nor can you be exploited without being involved in a social relation. Whereas in the conventional definitions, which are income-based, it has no necessary connection to your relationship to others. And so in the conventional conception of classes, there's no intrinsic relational component to it, unlike the Marxian.
Yes, actually, then that kind of leads into my next question on class. I think if we were to consider it as a class, as it's usually classes, especially in sociology, it's represented as being part of a series of variables, most famously class, race, and gender, as if the three of these had a watertight separation from one another. gender. Now, on the other hand, Stuart Hall, for example, famously argued that race is the modality in which class is lived, suggesting that we all live through class relations, but the way in which we experience them are mediated by these categories such as race and gender. So considering that the realization, let's say, of the class relation and class exploitation is intertwined with racialized and gendered oppression, do you think it's possible, even analytically, to separate class from other sociological categories?
Yeah, it's not only possible, it's essential. And I think Hall is terribly confused about this. Hall's aphorism has become famous because it's a way for academics and upwardly mobile professionals to pretend that class is less real than race, and all the real action is race and gender. So when Hall says, let's just start with Hall, he says, race is the modality through which class is lived. I think that's just terribly confused. Class is the modality through which class is lived. What does it even mean to say that race? It's as if to say that class exists on paper, but in the world, it's race. And to me, it's kind of shocking how such a confused expression is taken as a profound and deep appreciation of how capitalism works. It shows to me a profound confusion about how capitalism works. So just to be clear about this, if you're a working class Black person and you can't find housing or a job or health, what you're experiencing is the lack of housing, the lack of a job, and the lack of healthcare. It's exactly the same as a white person experiences it. That's why why class is a real abstraction and not a fictional one. So the first point to note is that it is simply wrong to say that race is the reality through which class is lived. Race is the reality through which race is lived, and class is the reality through which class is lived. And the confusion on this is simply a sign of the damage that neoliberalism has done to radical thought. Secondly, if you could not analytically separate class from race, then how could you even pose the question of how class and race relate to each other? Again, I just don't understand. It's a very common question. I think it again conveys a confusion, which is that if two things are intertwined in real life, then you cannot analytically separate them. But I would simply ask, would that be true? The whole point of analytical separation is to be able to examine causal properties in their distinctiveness. That doesn't mean that in real life they're physically separate. Analytical separation is a question of abstraction. Functional separation is a question of the realities in the world. You can analytically distinguish things that are intertwined, and you can analytically distinguish things that are independent of each other. One has nothing to do with the other.
So moving on to the capitalist relation and capitalism itself, this is something that actually comes up in your work. Given these deep antagonisms that capitalism generates while it's reproducing itself, as you claim, how does it survive?
Well, I've just written a book on this question. It's called The Class Matrix. In classical Marxism, in the New Left, of which Stuart Hall was a chief proponent, the idea was that capitalism survives through the force of ideology and what's called the superstructure, which works by socializing people into accepting their place in the relations of exploitation. So a worker is, through the educational apparatuses, through the media, through his social connections, he's socialized into accepting his place in the social structure. Capitalists don't need that kind of socialization because they benefit from it, but the workers are socialized into it. And that means then that the key to understanding capitalism's survival is culture, and the role that culture plays in generating a kind of worldview for workers, which locks them into their place in the structure. In my view, that's mistaken, because it requires that workers systematically suffer from cognitive failure. You can fool a worker about facts or policy that require specialist information. You can fool a worker into accepting free trade because you tell them free trade will help you keep your job. You can fool them into accepting tremendous tax breaks for the rich because you tell them that if the rich have more money, they'll invest it. And workers can go along with these things, even though they're fundamentally wrong, because they don't have access to the special knowledge that economic theory or economic analysis brings you. You can fool them about those things. But to fool them about accepting their place as wage laborers is much, much more difficult. Because here they don't need specialized knowledge to know that when they go to the job, they're suffering. When they go to the job, they have to face domination from the employer or the insecurity of being a wage laborer. This they experience directly every day. So it's hard to imagine how Marxists can say, on the one hand, workers are exploited and everything that exploitation entails, while also saying, on the other hand, that workers don't notice the fact that they're exploited or can simply be socialized into not understanding that exploitation. So to my mind, if you treat workers as reasonable, rational people, which you have to if you respect them, it's hard to imagine that the reason they accept their place in the structure is through ideology. To my mind, the reason they accept it is because it's rational for them to do so. And the reason it's rational for them to do so is because of all the risks and the enormous undertaking that they have to commit to if they want to organize collectively. So collective action and collective forms of resistance impose enormous costs and risks on workers. So most of the time, they choose to resist, but resist individually. But if they resist individually, they lose. They lose every time. Now, what you would ask, well, if they're losing, why do they keep doing it? Well, what they're losing is the prospect of dramatically improving their conditions, but they're winning something else, which is they keep their job. They go to the manager, they try to ask for a better deal. If they don't get it, they say, okay. They try to slow down their production as best they can while still keeping their job. They resist through absenteeism, but not to the point where they get fired. So what they do is they resist in every way they can, short of losing their job. But that means that they accept their place in the structure, which means that the structure remains stable. I call this resignation. So to my mind, the key to capitalist stability is not hegemony or ideology or culture, all of these things generating consent. I think the key is resignation, not consent. Capitalism survives because workers resign themselves. Now, how does resistance come about? It comes about when they're willing to undertake the strategy of collective action in spite of its risks. But that's very hard to do. And that's why collective action is unusual. It's rare.
Actually, I would concur in that your claim that nowadays it's more rational to seek individual paths to liberation than collective ones appears to be the case. And I can relate to this personally. I often participate in union meetings where at least one member would express their individual concerns about collective industrial action. Quite often, this is their need to keep up with mortgage payments because at least here in the UK, our wages get cut when we go on strike. And this seems to suggest also, though, that there is clearly a cost, but also that there's an assessment of the benefits being made, which seems like a bleak assessment that it actually won't be worthwhile taking this risk. To my mind, suggests not just resignation, but also a kind of maybe demoralization. This understanding, this idea that it's not worth it anyway, or that we have tried before and we've failed. We've only ended up losing lots of money and being stressed and all the rest of it. Right?
If the demoralization is an accurate assessment of what's out there, then it's simply a species of resignation. Demoralization is different from resignation if it's unduly pessimistic about what's out there. Then I think I would consider it as being a different thing. But if it's learning from hard lessons that we're probably going to lose, if it's saying that the rewards aren't worth all the risks we're taking, those are all dimensions, I think, of resignation.
And do you think this kind of demoralization, do you think it's an accurate assessment of
well, that's hard to say in a general way. That depends on the situation. I think that across all the specific cases in capitalism, again, I have to say that I doubt that workers systematically misunderstand the costs and the benefits. So I think there might be instances in which it's an undue pessimism or an unduly harsh assessment of the situation. But I think it's really important to respect the intelligence of ordinary people. And just like I would be highly skeptical of a theory that says that they consent to their own exploitation because it's treating them like idiots. So too, I'd be skeptical of a theory that say they are unduly pessimistic about their situation.
So it seems then that we are kind of caught in a bind because it doesn't seem rational to take part in collective action, and the only way it could be rational to take part in collective action is to actually do it and engage.
Well, I do think that the challenge is to get workers to willingly undertake some sacrifices, but you do have to make those sacrifices not seem suicidal. You do that, by lowering the risks and by socializing the cost as best you can. You'll never eliminate those risks or the costs, but you can bring them down. You do it through, first of all, pursuing goals that are in fact realistic and not suicidal. That means at the initial stages of a workers' movement, you start small. You try to go after campaigns that you think you can win, to raise their morale, to raise their sense of confidence. You try to create institutional and community resources that will kick into action if workers have to be without a paycheck for days or weeks on end, if they have to be without healthcare for days or weeks on end, just so they know they have something to fall back on. But even after doing all that, there is a sacrifice that they have to make. And for that, you have to generate a sense of a common identity. As I say in my book, you do have to have a sense of solidarity and mutual obligation to each other so that you rationally choose to take risks while knowing that those risks could impose some costs on you. You have to, in other words, you have to get people to willingly bear some costs. But they will only do that if they think that there's a realistic chance of a benefit at the end of that. That's the difference between risk and suicide. So what distinguishes a leftist from an ultra-leftist is that the ultra-leftist thinks if you just scream at them hard enough, they'll do what you want them to do, regardless of what the benefits are. And rational leftists understand that you're asking people to put everything they have on the line, which means you've got to make sure that the goals are realizable and achievable.
So in the recent years, there have been waves of unionized movements and working militancy and industrial action, such as University and College Union in the UK, as well as the Railways Union, Postal Workers Union. There have been some signs of life in the States. Do you think this is issuing from the costs just of not doing it just being unbearably high, or workers actually starting to realize there could be benefits to gain from collective action?
Well, I think workers always know that there are benefits, and they're pretty well aware of what the costs are. I think it's driven by something else in this case, which is a sense of confidence, and a sense that if they do, any individual worker, if he takes the chance of an industrial action, of a job action, he won't be doing it alone. And to my mind, that has a lot to do with the change in public culture that's come about in the past 4 or 5 years, where workers feel less isolated than they did in the first 15 years of the 2000s. And unions generating a kind of leadership within them, some unions, which say to the workers, we're with you, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure we win. I think that confidence that goals are achievable has a big role to play in their willingness to risk a strike.
And do you think this confidence is a product, or is it some kind of a sign that left parties and unions and so on are adjusting their discourse in a rational way, as you suggest?
Well, there's no left party in the United States, nor is there a left party in England right now. I mean, you had a chance at a left party, but Starmer's victory has turned the Labour Party into even a worse vehicle for workers' goals than it was under Blair. So what's going on at the level of unions, not at the level of a party? I don't know if I'd call it rational. Of course it's rational, but that's underselling it. What it is a understanding that if unions don't start fighting back, they're at the very last gasps of their existence. And now I think a lot of unions find even that threat to be acceptable to them. But in certain key unions in the United States and even in England, luckily there's been something of a change in the leadership's attitudes. And that change has had a lot to do with making their members more confident in the union and therefore willing to fight for the union.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to be that the rank and file membership are maybe for once actually pushing the leadership to.
I don't think they were pushing it. I think in both, especially in England, I think this is one case where the left has this romance of the rank and file, that the rank and file are always militant, but the leadership is holding them back. I think it can go either way. I think in England, it looks like the leadership had a lot to do with these strikes. And in the United States, I think it's similar to England, which is that once the leadership gave the signal that they're willing to fight, you saw the rank and file falling into line rather than the rank and file pushing and pushing and pushing and the leadership falling into line.
So I want to talk about, and since you also brought up Labour and the UK, and I think Labour, the current state of Labour maybe is also symbolic of the state of the establishment left in many circles. But I would like to seize on, in particular, the current impasse where we find ourselves. It's almost become a cliche to say that we are in this interregnum. We're at this moment of crisis crisis where something has to be done, where the decisions that are made now are going to impact, cascade down generations and decades and decades. So in my view, at least, we first need to come up with a good diagnosis, because it seems like a lot of different terms have been thrown around about this current late stage of capitalism that we are experiencing, including things like neoliberal authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism, illiberal democracies, and so on and so on. So how would you describe the current conjuncture of global?
I really don't think it's the real problem. I don't think the problem is that we have an insufficient or an inadequate characterization of the period. The left in England and the United States is so beaten down that the real challenge is to get any kind of workers' activism going again. To have the characterization of the period be the real constraint suggests that the left has all of its forces in place and it's mobilizing, and it now needs to know where to go in terms of generating a viable economic strategy for itself. But that presumes a level of mobilization and organization that simply isn't there right now. The left's main challenge right now can be described in very, very basic terms, and it'll be valid even among people who disagree on the nature of the period, on the character of the period. The basic challenge is to reignite class organizing and class struggle. Now, the challenge for that is not an intellectual one, it's a political one. There's an intellectual component to it, which is that much of the left has a very much of what we mistakenly call the left, has a very ambivalent attitude toward working people, towards the poor. And their main goal, their main motivation is to fight along for issues that are mainly of concern to middle class people: discrimination, cultural issues, identitarian issues. That's much of what's called the left right now. I think the constraint is to get them to focus on working people and the lives of working people as the axis of politics. That's a very basic problem. And it's so basic that you can legitimately ask, can we call this a left at all, if it doesn't realize that this has to be the center of their politics? And my feeling is you can't call it a left. I think that if you have a left that's debating whether or not class struggle should be central to their politics, it is not a left. And that's where we are right now.
So would you agree that following the breakdown of the post-war social democratic consensus, this kind of class identification and alignment between the working class and, say, traditional social democratic parties has broken down largely as a result of globalization and those industrial jobs going elsewhere to the global?
Well, let's separate the two. The first question is, has the link between the traditional left parties and the working class broken down? The second question is, why has it broken down? And I think the answer to the first question is a resounding yes. The left parties no longer represent the interests of workers. They represent the interests of managerial and professional classes far more than workers. And that's a big reason why the left discourse has become so contemptuous of workers. Now, as to why that's happened, well, I think that there are many causes of why that's happened. Globalization it started happening probably before globalization, and globalization only played a small role in that. And to be honest, I don't know if we'd need an entirely different interview to get at that. You're asking me extremely large questions in a very short interview.
Sure. Then I think we can maybe switch gears to maybe look at the populist right, or the resurgent far right, which has actually been good at carving into those constituencies that traditionally would have voted left, such as UKIP in the UK, but also Trump in the States. Is this, you think, a sign of the failure of the left to maintain that representation?
Absolutely. No, there's no doubt about it. Now, of course, the left didn't create the crisis. Underneath all this is an economic crisis that's raised people's anxieties. And those anxieties have been heightened by the fact that the state had responded to the economic crisis by imposing austerity on working class neighborhoods and regions. So you have both an underlying economic crisis and a government response that makes that crisis even worse for working people. But that could have been the occasion for a radicalization of labor. It could have been an occasion for the left parties mobilizing workers around jobs and around a deepening of social democracy. But instead, what you have is left-wing parties lecturing to workers that there's nothing that can be done, and that workers are in fact part of the problem because of their unions and because of their social attitudes. And those parties have switched their base from the blue-collar regions where they used to be to the urban areas where their most active base now is professional classes, and the party's discourse reflects the attitudes of the professional classes. So, to my mind, once the parties responded to the crisis in this way, the workers, men and women who have had to bear the brunt of the crisis are looking around for somebody, anybody who will represent them and attend to their economic anxieties. And it just so happens that the far right is taking advantage of this. This is absolutely a failure of the left.
This is actually something I had in mind to ask you. You say that the hegemony in the post-war consensus and the consent towards capitalism at that time was very much material. Workers could look forward to owning a house, getting a car, and some kind of social mobility. Yet, of course, this was expressed culturally, but it wasn't a product of culture, as you rightly point out. So then, if we look at right-wing populism today, from what you're saying, it seems like that is an expression of material precarity in the cultural, transmitted across cultural lines.
Yeah, look, there are only two possible answers. One is these people are always racist. They're always going to be racist. There's nothing you can do. It's built into their white skin, or that it's a response to what the circumstances that they're facing. And the fact that so much of the left is happy with the diagnosis that these people were born racist, will always be racist, it just shows how contemptuous they are of ordinary working people. And this is not a left. It has no connection to the left. It should not be called the left.
So if we look at this rise of contemporary populism, or whatever we would call it, particularly right-wing populism, and the case of course, of Brexit, now the jury is very much out on how to make sense of that, I think, still. But one tendency that I kind of take issue with is that the Brexit Leave voter, the average Brexit Leave voter, is a kind of a temporarily confused socialist. They had the right instinct, and that's actually a good thing that this won. And the reason I take issue with it is because this campaign was very much organized and mobilized around far-right and xenophobic discourses. So in that sense, what kind of rationality would you suggest is at play here?
For whom? The parties or the
for the working class?
Well, the rationality is that they are terrified that the EU means a flood of immigrants coming in, taking their jobs, and the flood of immigrants also eating away at social services. So they want to preserve the separation of their economy from Europe's economy. That's the rationality of it. But that it is wrapped up in a discourse of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Now, is that a confused socialism? Well, no, but workers are never instinctively socialist. So I don't know what that means. The confusion is on the part of the intellectuals as to what the root causes of it are and what to do about it. To my mind, it's pretty basic. The most consistent vote for Brexit was in the districts hardest hit with unemployment and with the harshest austerity measures. It's an astoundingly close correlation. There's an obvious, therefore, economic basis to the shift towards Brexit on the part of those districts, the voters in those districts. And that's as far as you can go in your analysis. Wanting now for them to be spontaneous socialists, it just shows that what you have is a bunch of isolated PhD students or PhDs who've read a bunch of mythical potted histories of working class struggle. And unless real life workers fit that description, as Brecht said, it means that the workers are disappointing the party, and the party is going to have to vote a new working class into being. So perhaps my diagnosis is one that you will find therefore objectionable or wanting, but I see an obvious economic reason for there to be the shift towards the right-wing parties, and I see a colossal failing on the part of the left to appreciate this, and they're going to reap that whirlwind. The workers don't give a shit what the left says or thinks. They're going to do the best they can in their circumstances. And if you keep ignoring their needs and treating them as disappointments, you will reap the fruits of that. At some point, you're just going to have to realize that they don't have to prove themselves to us. We have to prove ourselves to them.
Yes, and I think that really took place. We really had a resounding kind of loss in the 2019 election, which may have been a product of
It'll keep coming. It's not going to stop until the left decides that it's going to treat working people as real thinking human beings with real needs and real anxieties. Until it decides to do that, they will keep punishing the left.
So seizing on that, so you state that while the events of the past few years provide ample evidence for working class disaffection from the status quo and the corresponding motivation to seek new avenues for representation in the political economy, translating this motivation into collective action will require tactical innovation. So in what ways could this general rejection of mainstream political and economic economic institutions be channeled towards a society based on solidarity and equality?
We don't really know. We don't really know in detail how to do it because we are not yet doing it. And a great deal of the organizational and institutional innovations 100 years ago when the left was coming up were not planned. They were discovered through trying to build working class movements. And the best example of this is the workers, the Soviets in Petrograd in 1917, the various kinds of workers' councils in Italy, in Germany, in Russia. These were institutions that were discovered through struggle. So, right now, we can say at a very broad level what kind of tactical innovations we need, which is we need to find ways of reinserting left parties into the everyday lives of workers so that for the working class, those parties are built into their daily struggles instead of being institutions for whom they go and vote once every 3 years or 6 years or something like that. Okay, we can say that. Now, what shape those institutions will take? Hard to say. I mean, probably there'll have to be unions of some kind. Probably there'll have to be neighborhood organizations of some kind. But workplaces don't look like what they did 100 years ago, and neighborhoods don't look like what they did 100 years ago, which means the specific form that they take will probably end up being different. Now, what that'll end up being, we don't know until we try. That's why, again, I come back and say that our fundamental challenge isn't a proper characterization of the period or a proper analysis of where we are. Our fundamental challenge is simply the voluntarist challenge of reinserting parties into the lives, working lives and daily lives of workers, so they can think through these dilemmas with the workers instead of lecturing at them, which is what we like to do right now.
Shifting the scope a little bit to a global scale, we've considered the rise of this insurgent kind of populist right. Some call it neo-fascism, some don't, some see that as objectionable. But this has also, I suppose, arguably led to an increasingly aggressive form of imperialism and heating up of conflicts, which sadly only seems to be getting worse. So how would you suggest that a truly internationalist resistance towards this and for peace could be built?
Look, I think that when imperial violence is imposed on subordinate countries, they resist in whatever way they can. The real challenge for the citizens of the imperial countries is not to get the dominated countries to resist, because that resistance takes place anyway. The real challenge is how to figure out in the dominant countries how to slow down or block imperial aggression that their countries are carrying out on poorer countries, which means that the real challenge, I don't think the real challenge is internationalism and building virtually never been actual internationalism within the working class. It's mostly an affect that intellectuals have had. The obstacle to imperial aggression, the most effective obstacle, is domestic. For left-wing parties and working people within the United States or within England, within France and Germany, to push against the aggression that their governments are waging on the poor. Now, that's actually good news because it means that the main task is national class struggle, not international solidarities. So, solidarity is easy to do when you're organized. If by internationalism you mean coordination of actions across borders, that's virtually never happened. This is a fantasy that intellectuals carry around. It's virtually never happened. It's very rare. The most effective block to imperialism has been resistance in the third world with some whatever solidarity campaigns left-wing people can carry out in the first world. And the other block to imperialism has been real class struggle at home, to redirect the priorities of the government away from militarism, away from warfare, towards social welfare and social democracy. That means that the best tool against imperialism is the same thing that we're trying to build anyway for socialism, which is an active working class movement that has domestic concerns at heart and an eye towards imperial aggression in addition to that.
So we are decidedly operating on a national scale.
Yeah. Look, getting labor organization up and going within nation states is such a pipe dream right now that to even talk about international labor campaigns, it's just a realm of fantasy. I mean, it's nice to talk about it over coffee or in a seminar, but a big Zoom meeting between 5 labor activists is not going to get you labor solidarity. You got to first have a working class movement at all. You cannot have labor solidarity, working class solidarity across borders if there's no working class movement. And all working class movements start out as national movements, all of them.
Yeah, yeah. Great. And so then going back to class mobilization and organizing the working class, do you think that the party form continues to be relevant, and as well as the need for capturing political power? I ask this because we've left the long 2010s behind, and there were moments
Yes.
of horizontal organization, but we've also seen them being kind of fetishized and not meeting their expectations. So
I think
it's
horizontalism is a complete dead end.
Mhm.
It's if by horizontalism we mean permanent movementism without enduring institutional innovations and without some degree of political coordination. I think that's what we mean by horizontalism. The jury is in on that. It's a complete dead end. All these horizontalist efforts, all they ended up doing was creating more resources for the nonprofits and an army of young people going into the nonprofits and being lost there forever. And I had a friend in India who, this World Social Forum used to meet every couple of years. He had a great characterization. He called it was a trade fair for NGOs. It never got beyond that.
Mhm.
I absolutely feel that there needs to be a revival of party building across the world, a left-wing party building. Now, that can be through entering the existing left-wing parties and trying to transform them into, or I should say, to reform them into what they once were, the way the Corbyn movement tried to do in England. Or it could be trying to build a new party, the way the DSA is trying to be a left-wing party inside the United States. Either way, though, I do not think you can have a revival of the left through horizontalism, nor can you have it simply through trade union revitalization. You need to have also a political entity that's linked to trade unions, but independent of, so that you can avoid the kind of the practical orientation that unions have to take, which absorbs them into the employment relation rather than challenging the employment relation. So my model is a quite old-fashioned one. I think you need to have essentially socialist or communist parties linked to trade unions, but not absorbed by the trade unions, and vice versa. If we find through practice that something else works better, fine. But I think you should start with what's worked in the past and try to then innovate on it.
Yeah, and you've also mentioned that what worked 100 years ago may not be as relevant now, and particularly nowadays there are examples of left parties which reject the vanguard model, who come from that tradition but take on a more mass political line, and they seem to make important electoral gains, and even in some cases capture power.
Yeah.
Do you see a good future in that sort of tendency?
I see a short-term future for it, for sure, in that I think you can experience electoral success through these mass organizations. And I think you can win some minimal redistributive victories through them. But insofar as these mass organizations are multi-class, they are going to have a substantial element of people whose economic goals and redistributive goals are quite limited. People like yourself and myself, professional people, people more white-collar workers, skilled workers. So if your horizon is to try to dramatically transform capitalism or even go beyond capitalism, then you can't rely on a hodgepodge of multi-class actors and trying to find a common ground between all of them. What you need to do is to focus on working people whose needs cannot be met simply through some weak redistributive measures or through certain kinds of rights-based, recognition-based goals. Mm-hmm. You need your engine has to be I don't mean just blue-collar manufacturing workers. Your engine has to be wage laborers whose goals are more than just the centrist social democratic goals of a Sanders or a Corbyn. Now, that means then there has to be privileging of a certain component of the working class. Is that vanguardism? I don't know. I don't know what to call it. But I do believe that simply bringing in high-skilled workers, academic workers, and the white collar on an equal strategic footing as wage laborers can only have very short-term benefits, very immediate benefits. Once you get beyond mild redistributive welfarism, a lot of them are going to leave. A lot of them are going to be less interested. And therefore, you cannot allow them to hegemonize. The hegemony has to come from somewhere else.
And to speak to the hegemony, let's say, of a working class party over the rest of society, so I would like to actually backtrack a bit and look, for example, at how the bourgeoisie historically gained power. And what we noticed there is that the bourgeoisie was able to convince the rest of the population that the realization of their agenda was in their favor, including the workers and the peasants and so on. So what might such a program look like from a working class party perspective?
I don't know. Now you're asking us to, if I had that answer, I wouldn't be talking to you.
Okay.
We'll have to figure that out. I should say that bourgeoisie never did what you say they did. The bourgeoisie never took power through bringing other classes to their side. Everywhere in Europe where the bourgeoisie first took power, they did it by dint of dictatorships and by suppressing other classes. This is something I've covered in my second book, the book on post-colonial theory. But setting that aside, I think your general point is right, that a working class party will have to come up with a program that draws other classes to its side, that is to say, non-exploiting classes. Now, to my mind, at this moment, a Sanders or a Corbyn type program is adequate for that, because all workers have an interest in those programs, as do young professionals, skilled workers, many sections of the salaried classes, they all do. The dilemma of securing hegemony over other classes, that'll become more pressing once we move beyond these immediate, quite unambitious goals. How we do that will depend on which sections of wage labor are actually organized, what kind of concessions they're willing to make to other classes, and what kind of concessions they're able to make to other classes. This is a big reason why a lot of the left, there's a lot of nonsense on the left about privileged workers and privileged workers being the problem and having to give up their status in the work hierarchy. That's just wrong. The privileged workers are in the sectors that are the most dynamic in the economy. That's why they have high wages, and that's why they have very good benefits. If you don't capture most dynamic sectors of the economy and organize them, you won't be able to craft an agenda that draws other classes to your side. That was what happened with the pink tide, as Rene Rojas has shown in his brilliant essay in Catalyst. The pink tide fell apart because it had no real leverage inside the economy, because it organized the most precarious sectors of the working class, and they had nothing to offer to other classes.
Okay, thank you. And finally, I would like to, I know I've taken quite a bit of your time. I would like to round off the interview with a question on Turkey. As you may be aware, there were huge expectations regarding the elections last year, and almost all of the polls basically turned out to be wrong. And despite numerous cheating allegations and rigging and so on, Erdogan and his party have won. Could I get your analysis on that, first of all? In what ways do you think, based on your knowledge of what's going on, which is the way forward? What would you suggest, comrades in Turkey?
I don't have a sufficient grasp of the Turkish reality to give you an analysis of why Erdogan won and how he's keeping his power. I have very broad brushstrokes that I know. I do believe that he has managed to engineer enough growth in the economy and enough redistribution to bring significant sectors to his side and keep them at his side for close to 20 years now. So it is not based on just Islamism, as a lot of sociologists are saying, or culture, the management of culture. You cannot maintain power in a semi-developed economy like Turkey just by giving people symbols and the Quran. So he does have a firm anchor in the political economy, in spite of having very slow growth, very low rates of investment, and not being able to deliver much of the goods. That means that the left has to realize that it cannot fight him in the domain of culture, nor should it think that its chief obstacle is his cultural hegemony. I think his cultural hegemony is based on very material patronage and redistributive elements that he's put into place. And that means that the left's challenge is to undertake organizing and labor market activities, which are quite traditional and which they always did, where they try to show workers that a different kind of economic agenda will do more for them than these top-down patronage schemes that Erdogan has managed to put into place. Turkey is one of the 3 or 4 countries in the global south with the most admirable and glorious history of the left. It's one of the countries where the left had real power and real influence over society. India was another, South Africa was another, Mexico another. But my sense is that the current left in Turkey is quite hopeless. It's demoralized, it's split, and it's been overtaken by academics and intellectuals who are quite clueless. So in that sense, it's a lot like the left elsewhere, where it's lost connection with its natural constituency, and it spends its time in arcane, pointless debates, which are only of interest to intellectuals and academics. So the challenge for it then is like the challenge everywhere else, which is to reorient itself towards the lives of everyday people and not take the symbols of Erdogan's success, his Islamism, his culturalism, the symbols of his success as the key to his success. Understand that success is rooted in real material anchors, the way any enduring economic or political regime is. It has to recover its own materialism, but that requires engaging in real conflicts and not just academic debates.
Absolutely, yeah. And that was, I think, something that was overlooked. Particularly, there was also an anxiety due to the fact that a lot of, for example, aid that came from the ministry came with envelopes with a letter from President Erdogan with his signature. And a lot of people were actually thinking that, he's not perfect, but if we get rid of him, not even get this.
Yeah.
So
Modi is doing the same thing in India. Every one of his schemes, his redistributive schemes at the village level, comes with a picture of him or a signature from him. And when you're barely making ends meet, that goes a long way for you. And then the left turns out around and says he's succeeding because of his manipulation of symbols. He's succeeding because he's putting real food on people's tables and giving them wells and cooking gas and things like that. And it's pretty simple. There's no real mystery to it.
Yes, absolutely. And it is sad to see that some of the left also turns their back on people, saying they've basically made this decision based on just meager food and coal and so on. But
yeah, they're a big disappointment.
Yeah,
the poor people constantly disappoint intellectuals, unfortunately, and hopefully the poor will rise to the level where intellectuals can see them as being worthy of their time at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Vivek, thank you so much. This has been a great and excellent interview. It's certainly given me loads of things to think about. I'm very much grateful for your time.